Welcome, champions, to my series of ranking all of the champions of Idle Champions in a tier list, seat by seat, while we break down their mechanics and explain why they belong where they belong. Today we're diving into seat 6. Boy howdy is it a doozy. In my opinion, the most competitive seat in the entire game. Full of great support, utility, and some top tier DPS to boot. Let's dive in, shall we? As is tradition, we're starting with the core champion of the seat, which in this case is Asharra, the lawful neutral Aarakocra wizard. This burb can serve as pretty decent support or really good DPS when set up right. I actually explained her in my overview of the game, but that was right on the cusp of her nerf. She is shaped almost entirely by her specialization choices. Very early on, you have to decide on a group of races for her to buff with her bonds, between humans, dwarves and elves put together, or potpourri, which is a cluster of Aarakocra, dragonborn, lizard folk, minotaur, tieflings, and turtles. Oh my. Depending on which group you choose, she buffs those races by a decent amount. She also later chooses between half and half, a combo of halflings and mixed races like half-orcs or half-elves, short folk, which includes halflings but takes other shorties like gnomes, goblins, and kobolds, and lastly exotic races, which is basically everything that's left over. So she has the option of buffing every race in the game. That's her support. How she turns into a DPS is the fact that if there are 4 of a selected race slotted in your active formation, Asharra herself will also receive that buff, of which she can double down, and receive the buff from both of her selected bonds. So if you take up 8 slots in your formation, with 4 from your first selected bond and 4 from your second selected bond, she will become a powerhouse. At the end of the day, if you want her to be your DPS, it's all about knowing your roster and what you have to work with, and what 8 champions would be your best supports to use for the bonds you have the options for. Potpourri is often your best pick for the first bond, as there are some great supports in that category, but Asharra herself is also included in that count, which is a great start since 8 champions is a pretty hefty investment in restricting your formation. Half and half is probably the most common pick for the second bond, as there are some very good supports in that category. But again, it all depends on what you have access to. She also gets Take Flight, which helps solidify her role as a DPS, where she increases her damage by 10% multiplicatively every 5 seconds up to 20 times while your formation is under attack. Her ultimate can be useful as it pushes all enemies away from your formation before launching a fireball at a random enemy, dealing splash damage. Early on, she's not going to work for a lot of people as a DPS, because you simply won't have the number of champions required to get those bonds rolling. But the fact remains that she is actually a good scaling DPS that is a core champion, so she's pretty easy to gear for. Pre-nerf Asharra, where she only required 3 in each bond, was certainly easier to tinker with. As she is now, I think Asharra is a high B, maybe a low A. But let me tell you, she's got some hefty competition in this seat. Second is Alyndra, the true neutral elf cleric/wizard. She serves as raw support and is our 4th hero of the plains. The others up to this point being Orkira, Whittle, and Briv. A very powerful affiliation overall. And we're not even done, as we have Freely, Avrin, and Penelope in the future to talk about. Knowing this affiliation is important for Alyndra because she specifically synergizes with each and every one of them. To start off, she gets Portent, where she randomly chooses 2 champions she is adjacent to every 30 seconds to guide their attacks, increasing their damage. Then she gets Brows of Judgment, giving her a chance to mark enemies that spawn, with a guarantee of marking bosses, which increases the damage bonus of Portent for each marked enemy on screen, stacking additively, bosses counting for more. Before I go into the depth of her next formation ability, I want to say her ultimate lasts for 30 seconds, and increases the damage all enemies take for an amount equal to her Portent. Quite useful actually. Then she gets the formation ability that name drops her affiliation, Heroes of the Plains, where she enhances the formation abilities of other members within her affiliation on champions under the effect of her Portent. So for example, if you have Orkira, Whittle, and Briv, in your formation and you have Portent active on your DPS. For this example, we'll say Nahara. Whittle's vampiric gaze effects will be flat increased on her, and Briv's nethery steel will also be flat increased on her. Orkira's works a bit different, in that her elemental fire will be increased for each portented champion under the effect of her lesser restoration, multiplicatively. So since she only heals those not adjacent to her, you'll want to make sure any champion under the effect of Portent are not adjacent to Orkira for maximum effect. And keep in mind, she also has a gear slot and 2 feats for this formation ability, making her able to scale all of these other champions with investment quite well. This also makes Alyndra's specialization choices more important, which is a choice between allowing Alyndra to portent 3 champions, not just 2, effectively making Orkira's synergy better, along with Freely and Penelope, but we're not going to get into them here since I haven't covered them yet. Just know that they synergize in somewhat of a similar way. And her other choice doubles the chance to mark enemies and increases the buff by 100%. So how you plan to position your formation, how many of the affiliation are present, and specifically which ones from that affiliation, all matter for Alyndra and where you're going to place her and specialize her. As is her theme as a whole, when set up right, her synergy just gets crazy, like having Whittle's attack speed increase pop off on portented champions, making them attack like a machine gun. But also increases Whittle's tasty friends, so Alyndra works almost as a pseudo-speed champion as well. She is fun and I think she's a solid A. While she has a lot to offer, she's basically bound to her affiliation to be able to thrive. And in this game as a whole, with variants, patrons, and trials, you will be hard-pressed to always have access to all of them. And even when you do, it restricts your options for your formation, although being restricted to her affiliation isn't necessarily a bad thing. But even then, she isn't the best damage buffer in this seat. And note in the future, when a new hero of the plains comes up, I will also explain how Alyndra interacts with them in more detail. And how I said Alyndra is a pseudo-speed, there is a better speed champion in this seat you'll see coming up later. But there is a scenario technically where Alyndra is kind of a better speed champion, but I'll get to that in a bit. Next up we have the Dungeon Master, a lawful good human wizard, who gives us a combo of gold, healing, and support. A very interesting character to put into a tier list for a few reasons. First off, rules don't apply to him. He gets to start in all adventures, even if a patron, variant, or trial would otherwise restrict him. Second, we don't know any of his ability scores, they're all question marked out. But what we do know is he qualifies for any stat-based buffing ability like Nrak, Dadius, or Whittle. His first formation ability is Patience, Young Ones, where he increases the damage of the formation for each champion 20 years old or younger. Ideally, you'd want as many as you can, but it is a limited pool to draw from that don't all particularly synergize, so do the best with what you have. Just make sure you at least have one, because this formation ability will be a 0 if you don't have any slotted. He also gains Words of Encouragement, which gives temporary hit points to everyone in your formation upon entering a new area while he is present. You might think, why wouldn't he be present in your formation if you've slotted him? Well, that's because of his next formation ability. With Disappearing Act, when you enter a new area, there is a chance that he'll go away and will be replaced with Uni, the Unicorn. While he's gone from the formation, Gold Find is increased, so you're bouncing between his healing and his Gold Find. But if you go back to a previously completed area, he will always come back. This makes his Gold Find rather clunky and hard to use in a dedicated Gold Find formation. But that's alright, there's a better Gold Find champion in this seat anyway. His ultimate is pretty interesting, in that when used, it immediately resets another champion's ultimate that is on cooldown, specifically the one with the current longest cooldown remaining. It absorbs that cooldown and makes it the ultimate cooldown of the Dungeon Master. He also increases the damage of the formation based on how long his ultimate is currently on cooldown for, so you want to actively be using it and potentially on long cooldowns. How much does it increase your formation's damage? I have no idea. I don't see anywhere where it states in the game the math for that, so if anyone does know, please leave a comment and enlighten my plebeian brain. What I do know is it's not for all that much. But anything is welcome, as Dungeon Master isn't the greatest buffer by any stretch. And for the record, I think a very good ultimate to use this on would be Beetle and Grim, as they don't have any cooldown reduction whatsoever. But we haven't talked about his entire purpose in this game yet, and that's through his specializations. His first two are choices between solidifying either his or Uni's presence in the formation. The first decreasing his chance of appearing by 75%, while increasing the gold find bonus of Disappearing Act by 100%. And second decreases his chance of disappearing by 25%, while increasing the hit points gained from Words of Encouragement by 100%. His third specialization choice is where it's at though. Special Guest Star. It only shows up when you're in a variant, patron, or trial, and will randomly select a champion in your roster that is currently locked out of the run because of those restrictions, and will allow you to use them against those rules. He will, however, specifically target champions in a seat, if that seat is entirely inaccessible. If you don't like who he picked, you can just restart the run and attempt for a better pick. This can be an absolute godsend when you're getting stuck on a particularly difficult or restrictive patron variant. Like, for example, let's imagine you're in Strahd's Might Makes Right. You barely have any options, but the Dungeon Master picks Nahara. Now you can also use her specialization to bring the entire Black Dice Society. Keep in mind, Dungeon Master needs to be active in your formation to use the Special Guest Star. If you remove him, they will be removed as well, but you can simply just place them in again. If I were to rank him based solely on his tags, he wouldn't be very high, maybe a C. But for how much he can literally just break the game in your favor when you need it the most, I think his usefulness is right there with Asharra, somewhere between high B and low A. You will absolutely use him over better buffers in this seat if he gives you access to an important champion to use. Now we have Evelyn, the neutral good human paladin. What you might call the black sheep of this seat. She serves as a tank and a support, but she's dead average in both. Nothing makes her excel as a tank, and she only gives the group one buff through Divine Prayer, increasing the damage of everyone behind her. She has many ways to increase the buff via Channel Divinity, Steadfast Might, and Conduit of the Light, which increases the effectiveness of Divine Prayer after she hits an enemy, for each enemy attacking her, and if she's been healed recently, respectively. Her specializations are also just a choice between buffing Divine Prayer. The first being, if anyone other than her has taken damage, it will be increased by 300% for 15 seconds, or if she damages an enemy that has damaged her, for the same 300% for 15 seconds. Basically, you'd only ever take the second if she's your main tank in the front of a single tank formation. Her ult has her mount on her Pegasus and charge down the battlefield in a line, damaging and stunning enemies. Her biggest problem is even when everything is stacked just right, Divine Prayer is still very basic, and she offers really nothing else while also being in a seat that is, again, in my opinion, the most competitive seat. The only time you will ever use her is if you are just desperate for tanks, unless she gets a rework down the line. Hard D tier. Like others in the D tier, she's not a complete waste, but every other option in this seat is better than her in their roles, and even if she wasn't in this seat, she probably still wouldn't see use. Following Evelyn is Krond, the chaotic evil half-orc fighter. And let me tell you, if his ideal formation wasn't so restrictive, he would probably be my DPS main, because half-orcs and Eldritch Knights, thematically, are my damn jam, baby. He has only one formation ability, Survival of the Fittest, but it is a hardy, fatty scaling flat number. For every slot in your formation taken up by either an evil champion or a champion with a strength of 16 or higher, he increases his damage multiplicatively, and of course he counts for 1. His specializations are choices between 3 cantrips to add on top of his primary attack, which hits the frontmost enemy. First is Thunderclap, which deals additional area of effect damage to enemies near his target. Second is Shocking Grasp, causing additional damage to the enemy and stunning them for 3 seconds. And the third is Firebolt, which launches extra bolts of fire for additional damage. Basically a choice between Cleave, Crowd Control, or Armor Breaking. His ult is a pretty standard AoE as he throws his hammer, teleports to the enemy, and casts the second level spell Shatter. Although that means he's at least a level 15 Eldritch Knight to be able to use Arcane Charge, so why doesn't he use a 3rd or 4th level spell? And he could even just use the spell first so that when he uses Action Surge, he can make 3 attacks with his extra attack instead of just 1 for the throw. And if we assume he's level 18, he could even cast the spell, choose to teleport with Arcane Charge, bonus action to attack with improved War Magic, then 3 attacks via the extra attack as the Action Surge. Although you wouldn't be able to cantrip one of those attacks because, contrary to popular belief, Action Surge doesn't give you another bonus action. And even if it did, you wouldn't be able to cast the cantrip because of Jeremy Crawford. Why can't I cast a bonus action cantrip at the end of my turn without for some reason, somehow retroactively meaning I couldn't have cast a leveled spell with my action? It makes 0 sense. They're supposed to be especially swift. Anyway. He has a gear slot tied to both the damage of his cantrip choice and the survival of the fittest, so he's very streamlined. Fill your formation with a mix of your best evil and or strength 16 plus members, select your preferred cantrip, and let him bash his way to victory. He's a very good DPS once you invest in him, but that is an important distinction. If you're looking to focus on him, know that even though his numbers look great, he's not going to be amazing right from the get-go. I know that should go without saying, as any champion is going to perform fairly subpar without some form of investment. But with investment, he does scale incredibly well, and takes a very high rank because of that. Many people consider him the second best DPS in the game. Restrictive formations always make me a bit hesitant personally, as with Patrons, Variants, and Trials you lose more of your oomph than others, but even so I'm putting him in a high A tier. Again, with a little asterisk that he does take investment before he pays out. Still, very cool. That leads us to Krull, the lawful evil Turtle Cleric. This thick evil boy has some pretty meh formation abilities and then some amazing debuffs. Let's start with the meh. First off, we'll talk about Arkan's Army, where he increases the damage of evil champions by a rather low amount, which is even further decreased for each good champion in the formation. Lackluster as hell. Then he gets the Master's Call, which increases the damage of Arkan, the core champion of seat 12, by a rather low amount. That is even further reduced the farther Krull is away from Arkan. Not only is this lackluster to begin with, Krull has no positional formation abilities, and Arkan requires those to scale his damage. So it's a strange design of synergy to begin with. Then he gets Dark Order Synergy, which increases the effect of Arkan's army by 100% for each Dark Order member adjacent to Krull, which is Krull, Arkan, and Torogar, who takes his place in seat 10. But he's very similar in that he synergizes with this affiliation, but also doesn't have a positional formation ability for Arkan to make use of. It all feels very off to me to go out of your way to make a synergy that actually doesn't synergize together at all. 2 slots without a positional formation ability for Arkan is actually pretty bad, even if you buff him up a lot otherwise. So with all this in mind, where would I rank Krull? S tier. That's right, because even with all that not so greatness cluttering up his formation abilities, he also has his debuffs. Draconic Plague. Every 5 seconds, and with his primary attack. He will apply one of these 3 debuffs that gain a stack every 3 seconds, and cap out at 10 stacks, between Pilfer, increasing the gold enemies drop, Pain, increasing the damage they take, and Traitor, which makes a damaged enemy emit an AoE splash of a % more damage than they received. His specializations are a simple choice between increasing the effectiveness of one of these 3 debuffs, and his ultimate summons multiple ghouls that lumber forward and explode on the nearest enemy. This leaves behind a pool of goo that deals damage for 30 seconds, making it excellent for armor breaking. Now, all of these debuffs stack additively, unless they are spread via Virulent Strain, which has a base 10% chance to proc off a debuffed enemy being slain, to spread their debuffs to another enemy, which will make it stack multiplicatively, and be able to be stacked above 10. This can only spread a maximum of 4 times, so the maximum would technically be 40. But even so, this allows you to get some crazy damage buffing with Plague, some amazing gold find with Pilfer, and a hefty splash damage for that Traitor. If you've ever wondered why you're left with 1 enemy on screen on a boss stage, Traitor is probably why. As you hit that enemy, then Traitor's splash hits every other enemy and kills them because it's more damage than the initial hit, but then they're left behind because they weren't affected by it. This is both a blessing and a curse. For one, this is great for gold find formations, because you can focus a boss wave down to just one enemy to Azaka farm with, and hopefully you've procced Virulent Strain, triggered off one of the others dying, allowing you to stack that pilfer debuff multiplicatively on that lone survivor. But if you're actually stuck with that last mob, you might want to consider debuff swapping to spike your damage on that one, or pull out Jim if you own him and turn it into a chicken. Though this comes with the warning that they may one day stop Jim from being an option to do this. Also, his debuffs, while very strong on their own, do require that spread to really pop off. So he's a little RNG, while also requiring you to be able to get kills to be able to spread it. And they're not sticky. However, since they are in fact debuffs, he takes his place as the most important champion to slot if you're working toward a click debuff formation. Oh yeah, and 20 wisdom, so unrackable as well. Keep in mind though, even though your champions themselves will be hitting harder, Trader does not scale your bud if you for some reason rely on bud spiking. But still, he's very, very strong. Maybe in the lower bracket of S tier because he does have some drawbacks, but his multi-purpose debuffs are very, very good. And finally, we have our next evergreen champion since Blushi in Seat 2, Reya the lawful good human/celestial paladin. Her kit mostly revolves around her Searing Radiance, which is a decently girthy bonus she gives to champions that are adjacent to her, and is quadrupled on fiends. This is further increased by her Echoes of Zariel, which has an angelic gaze swoop over the party randomly. Could be 3 champions, could be all 10. Then return back to Reya and increase the effect of Searing Radiance multiplicatively based on how many champions it gazed upon. This is a constant cycle that is always changing. Her specializations are a simple choice between either guaranteeing good or lawful champions being gazed upon during Echoes of Zariel. So just choose whichever you have more in your formation that you plan to use her in. She also gains Celestial Champions, which increases the damage of both lawful and good champions. This does double dip for those who are both, but as it stands right now for DPS, that's only Dritzt and Binwin, and neither are frontrunners for an ideal DPS to focus on. Her ultimate has her slam down in the middle of the screen with a shockwave that puts enemies to sleep for 10 seconds. While they're honk chewing away, they receive additional quote massive damage from champions. I don't know what's up with this seat, but they don't say the math for this anywhere either. At least with Alyndra they said it's equal to Portent, but Dungeon Master and Reya, who the hell knows? Again, if you know numerically what her ultimate actually offers as a DPS buff, please let me know in the comments. At the end of the day, I think she's a low B champion. Her Searing Radiance gets pretty good actually. Her numbers get decently high, and she's particularly decent if using her with a lawful or good DPS. It is unfortunate for her that she's in a seat with so many other powerhouses. But for an evergreen, she's not bad. You can even guarantee getting her 2 different golden epics just through patrons, which really helps her numbers climb. Then we got Sergeant Knox, the neutral good human fighter. From the School of Hard never mind. A tank and support, he fits in a very unique spot where he excels both with positional formation abilities, but also specifically with 2 core champions, Celeste and Mach-O's. First he gets Rallying Cry, which increases the damage of everyone behind him, increased for each positional ability affecting them. This makes him simple to slot in your formation and actually quite good for Artemis if you need multiple tanks, since all of the DPS in your formation will receive this, and you're already focusing on positional formation abilities. However, if you have a lot of debuffers or non-positional buffers, he's going to fall off steeply. He also gets Blessed by Saloon, where if he's in range of Celeste's Mass Cure Wounds, he takes 25% less damage from any attack that wouldn't instantly kill him. And Ally of Convenience, where if he's adjacent to Makos, he increases both the effects of his own Rallying Cry, as well as Makos' Dark Blessing by 200%. His ultimate is a multi-hitter that stuns a few enemies, and his specializations are a pretty important choice based on why you're using him. First, you can make Rallying Cry stack multiplicatively with buffs applying to the post-stack value, but decreasing the base percentage by 35%. Altruistic Rally, which increases the effect of Celeste's Crusader's Mantle and Makos' Dark Blessing. Or Shield Wall, increasing his health by 50%. Overall, he's pretty average that's kind of designed for newer players with his core champion synergy. And while an Artemis formation might find some use for him, there is a better positional buffer for him in this seat. I think he's a high C. Basically, to sum him up, he's better than Evelyn. Speaking of a better positional buffer for Artemis, lastly, we have Shandie, the chaotic good halfling rogue, a speedster and a support. Her speed comes in the form of dash, which is actually really good. But what you get is what you get. You can't scale her speed ability at all, well, other than specializations. It increases the game speed by 25% when the formation has not been under attack for 1 minute. So as long as you're going through the early sections of a run, and you can just blast through enemies, she will get you there a lot quicker. Now going back to Alyndra, this is what I was talking about. Shandie increases game speed, but the game speed is capped out at a 10 times increase. So while Shandie is great, but if for some reason you are otherwise reaching that 10 times via potions and Modron cores, or if you can't last a minute without taking damage, Alyndra's synergy with Whittle and making her spawn enemies faster is technically better for speed. But at the same time, enemy spawn speed only affects so much, so you know. If dash can be up and you're not at the speed cap, dash is amazing. She also gets agile allies, where she buffs champions within 2 slots of her by an amount based on how many champions she is adjacent to that have a dexterity of 15 or higher. This is another one of those, if she doesn't have any, it will be 0 and she doesn't count for it. So make sure you have a minimum of 1 champion adjacent to her with 15 or more dexterity. I've also seen some people confuse this for some reason. To receive this buff, a champion does not need the dexterity. It simply scales off how many she is surrounded by. So make sure to get as many Dex 15 plus champions adjacent to her as you can. She also gets Explosive Arrow. In a way, this counters dash. When your formation does come under attack, she begins to fire explosive AoE rounds that scales for each enemy she hits, and with this she increases the damage of the column in front of her. And this is why she's technically better than Sergeant Knox for Artemis. While she isn't a DPS, she does offer 2 separate formation abilities for him to observe. If using her with Artemis, try to get all of your DPS in range of agile allies, and as many DPS in the column in front of her as possible for Explosive Arrow. Her ultimate has her throw smoke grenades and caltrops on the field, dealing damage over time, and reducing the enemy's chance to hit your formation. And her specializations are a choice between increasing the effective dash by 100%, going from 25 to 50%, increasing the effectiveness of Explosive Arrow by 100%, or having agile allies also scale from neutral and evil champions being adjacent to her for 50% each. With the third, if you surround her with Dex 15 plus neutral and or evil champions, the scales up quite well. She is an excellent buffer and a staple in any speed formation, as well as natively being usable for every patron. Hard A tier champion. Whew. And that is it for Seat 6. A bit longer of an episode, but this seat is full of powerful and mechanically interesting characters. Don't forget to slam that like, sub, and bell. And I never really talk about it, but you could always follow my Twitter. I don't do much there other than announce a new video, but you never know, I might start picking it up. Leave a comment about the tier list, your thoughts on the champions, and whether or not you think I should make a Discord channel. Would you join it? I've never really thought there'd be enough people who would actually join to justify it, but just putting some feelers out there. Stay tuned for the next seat, and I'll see you then. Have a hell of a time out there, champion.